Good afternoon and welcome to the second annual Hearst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. My name is Evan Zislis. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative. The work of HCI is focused on promoting dialogue, increasing understanding, and facilitating opportunities for meaningful collaboration among the communities of Aspen to Parachute, Colorado, located on ancestral lands of the Ute people. Today is the 6th event of an 8-part speaker series in a collaboration with the regional public libraries and chambers of commerce of Aspen, Basalt, Carbondale, Glenwood Springs, Newcastle, Silt, Rifle, and Parachute. Throughout the series, interested stakeholders tune in to learn more about the issues facing our communities and the local experts working to find collaborative solutions to the shared challenges of our region. Today's topic is Broadband Internet in rural Colorado, co-hosted by the Silt Branch Library and the Colorado River Valley Chamber of Commerce. Today's Zoom host is Garfield County Libraries, and interpretation to Spanish is brought to you by Velasco Language Services. Alex, would you please help everyone to learn about how to select the language of their choosing?
You got it. Allow me a couple of minutes to share my screen here. Okay, welcome everybody and thank you for being here. As we just mentioned, this is a Zoom webinar format, meaning we have 2 ways of communicating. We have the chat option if we just have a quick comment to make, or if we have any technical difficulties with Zoom, please communicate through the chat and we'll get to you as soon as we can. If you do have questions about the content or questions for our presenters today or our moderators, please try to use the Q&A. This will save the questions until there is an appropriate time to answer near the end of the presentation. Finally, this is being presented in English and Spanish simultaneously. If you would like to choose a different language, please go ahead and go to your options at the bottom right bar of your Zoom menu. If you'd like to listen in English, please click English. In Spanish, please click Spanish. If you're getting any audio interference, you can hit mute original audio. If you need any help with these functions, please say so in the chat and we'll get to you when we can. That's it for me.
Thanks, Alex. Once again, please use the chat feature for technical questions and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions for the panel. We'll leave time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I want to introduce our moderator and our esteemed panel for today's discussion, starting with Brandy Reitter. Brandy currently serves as the Executive Director of the Colorado Broadband Office in the Governor's Office of Information Technology. Her experience includes 15 years in local government as a town manager, where she worked on community broadband projects in various rural communities across Colorado. Her philanthropic work includes serving on the boards of the Colorado Trust Foundation and Western States Arts Federation. In 2020, she won the City Manager of the Year Award by the Colorado City and County Management Association. Next is Derek Hanrahan. Derek is a trustee on the Town Council in Silt, Colorado. He's the Senior Director of Products for the AZDS Interactive Group. He's also an adjunct professor of Colorado Mountain College, where he has been teaching technology courses since 2013. Derek has over 25 years of experience building and managing technology projects and platforms for Fortune 500 companies, startups, nonprofits, healthcare, distribution, retail, and tourism industries. Next up is Kevin Batchelder, Garfield County Manager. Kevin has 33 years of local government management experience in 3 communities, including 8 years in Garfield County. As county manager, Kevin serves the citizens of Garfield County by working to implement the policies of the Board of County Commissioners and by managing a large organization that provides quality services to the citizens across the county. Kevin has a BA from Colorado State University and an MA from the University of Minnesota. He's a member of the International City and County Management Association. And lastly, Diane Kruse. Diane is the CEO of NeoConnect, a broadband consulting firm that works with local governments on improving internet and broadband services in their communities. Diane has been working in the telecommunications and broadband industry for over 35 years. NEO is a national firm, but has consulted with the majority of municipalities and counties within the state of Colorado. We're honored to have everyone joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brandy.
Great, thank you for those wonderful introductions, Evan. We really appreciate it. As you can tell, we have a really great set of panelists here, and I'm just thankful that I can get to know my colleagues and discuss a very important subject. So with that being said, I will go ahead and jump right in because I'm really excited to hear from our colleagues on the digital divide and broadband. So I'm going to start out with Derek. In your role as a trustee for the town of Silt, what is your perspective on broadband as a utility and how the lack of service impacts your community?
Sure. First of all, thank you to everyone for giving me an opportunity to participate in this panel. And I think your terminology is exactly correct, Brandy. Broadband is a utility, like water or electricity. It is now fundamental to how we all live our lives in the 21st century. In spite of this, broadband internet, at least in Western Colorado, those services have not kept pace with this shift to it being a utility. A quick personal example, I pay for 1 gigabit of speed from my internet service provider, but I only get about 120 megabits, which, setting aside the technology terms, I get about 12% of what I'm actually paying for. So if you think about it in the context of another product, let's say milk, for example. Imagine you bought a gallon of milk, but you only got 12% of it. How long would you continue to buy milk from that company? The reason they can do this is because they use 2 words, up to. So you get up to the amount that you're paying for. And this is the only service or industry that I can think of that actually is allowed to and gets away with not giving people what they're actually paying for. In terms of my larger community, the ways that this impacts all of them include things like emergency services, for example. So our fire and police departments here in Silt and the surrounding area are somewhat constrained by the technical limitations, and that affects their ability to deliver time-sensitive aid to our community. Another one would be municipal services. So things like community outreach, outbound messaging, interaction with the residents of the town of Silt as a whole. And that's limited because not all of the members of our community can afford and or have access to broadband connectivity. A third aspect would be agriculture or ranching operations. So the lack of connectivity affects them in that they're not able to use certain tools like Internet of Things devices or monitors. So we're in a drought right now, and they cannot effectively monitor the needs for water throughout their farm. And that can mean one of 2 things. Either they don't give it enough water in a timely manner, or they give it too much and waste that valuable limited resource that they have. And the last one I'll mention is economic development. We here in Western Colorado are challenged to lure new businesses to our communities due to a lack of robust broadband internet options. Almost all businesses, particularly small ones nowadays, require robust internet connectivity, whether you're in a trade, whether you do some sort of provide a service, retail, dining, healthcare, all of these traditional small businesses and startups, those industries now require good internet connectivity. And until we get it, we will not be able to compete for those new businesses as a region.
Great. Thank you for that. And those are really great examples, Derek. And I know as a former local government person, all those examples resonate very, very heavily with me as well. I just want to take a little bit of time to open it up to some of my colleagues on the call to see if they want to offer up any other perspectives as broadband as a utility, because I know we have a lot of really great expertise on the call. So if you just want to raise your hand, offer some more, I'd be happy to entertain that.
Brandy, I don't know if you can see me raising my hand, but I wanted to weigh in a little bit on what Derek just said. So first of all, the fact that you can subscribe to a gigabit worth of service is somewhat shocking to me. And yes, that you're getting 100 meg, which is maybe a tenth of what you're subscribing to, is terrible. But the fact that you can get 100 meg is a big deal as well. Most of the citizens on the western slope and in Garfield County, in fact, there's over 7,000 homes in Garfield County alone that do not have access even to the minimum requirement of 25 megabits per second in download speeds and 3 megabits per second in upload speeds. And after the pandemic hit, residential broadband usage increased by 92% within a month after the pandemic. And so people were working at home, they're attending classes, they were conducting telehealth appointments at home, and they did not have adequate internet service to support those applications, and they couldn't work at home and they couldn't attend school. A lot of kids on the western slope were attending school by sitting in their cars at the library so that they could get access to Wi-Fi services. So I absolutely agree with you. The government services and agricultural applications and Internet of Things, those are critical applications, but even just the very basics of being able to work and attend classes at home. I think we saw the impact of the pandemic, and the limited availability of broadband for our citizens was a huge problem. So in response to the pandemic, there have been a number of programs that Brandy's going to talk about. But I just wanted to say that, there's just basic requirements of being able to work and attend class at home that we saw were really challenging during the pandemic.
Great, thank you for that. And maybe Kevin, we can hear some of your perspective, because I'm going to ask you the next question on broadband. And you're a county manager, you've been in Garfield County for a number of years. And what partnerships and collaborations have you used to expand broadband in your community? And what were some of the outcomes?
I'd be happy to talk about that. Our whole program is based on a partnership, and there's multiple partners, but our primary partner is Region 10. And Region 10 is a coalition of counties and local governments and special districts in the west central and southwest part of Colorado. And they have become a real potential partner for Garfield County, because they are trying to expand on a much larger basis, a regional, if not statewide, redundant internet supply throughout Colorado, so that they have resiliency and redundancy. And that internet supply that Region 10 is building comes right through Garfield County down I-70. So it makes all the sense in the world for us to partner with them in order to provide a middle mile network for the 4 or 5 communities in Garfield County that are along I-70, and that's Glenwood Springs, Newcastle, Silt, Rifle, and Parachute. And our intent and our purpose is to expand that middle mile network to those communities along I-70 in order to allow us to attract partners to a strong middle mile network, so that they can provide private, competitive, last mile service in each community. Now, each of our communities has some level of broadband service, but certainly not in the more rural areas of the county. And as Diane said, there are 7,000 households in Garfield County that do not have internet service. And I think the best thing Garfield County can do is make that middle mile network more robust, so that we can attract partners, both public and private, to connect to our carrier neutral locations and expand broadband service to our communities, so that there's more competition, the prices come down. We can partner with schools and higher education and libraries and municipalities And this is a model that we know has worked well in many other places in the country. And I think the distances involved in Garfield County, it's 40 something miles from Glenwood Springs to Parachute. It's 26 miles from Glenwood Springs to Rifle. And Silt and Newcastle are about 10 miles each and removed from Rifle or Glenwood Springs. And those distances make it very difficult for the private sector to bring robust broadband services to what they consider a limited number of rooftops. And Garfield County, I think, through our partnerships can help strengthen that middle mile network so that these private and public partners can focus on last mile service, making internet supply and internet service much more robust and reliable in Garfield County. And I will also mention that all of this is being done with a grant from the state of Colorado's Department of Local Affairs. We wouldn't be able to do it without that partnership. CDOT's a partner, and again, Region 10 is our partner, but we are also reaching out to each of these 5 municipalities for help and assistance in terms of locating these Meet Me centers or carrier neutral locations, if you will, so that we can have a more efficient system and work in partnership with each of the municipalities.
That's a really great experience, and I agree with you. You know, I think when you're in rural Colorado, you know, you're or rural America, period. You know, you look those.
We lost Brandy for a couple of minutes. We hope she is back as soon as her connection straightens out.
Somewhat ironic, isn't it? Maybe I'll say a couple of things. So Garfield County has been working on improving broadband for a couple of years. We worked with them to put together a roadmap, and the roadmap included improving middle mile infrastructure. And what Kevin was talking about is just basically building fiber between the communities and allowing fiber access to the internet hubs that are typically located in Denver, Salt Lake, Phoenix, some of the locations that are large metropolitan areas. And one of the reasons why broadband is challenging in rural areas is that the internet service providers have very limited access to middle mile infrastructure. So as part of the roadmap, we recommended that Garfield County look at building fiber between their communities and ultimately getting connectivity to Denver and to Salt Lake City. And so Garfield County, through their Department of Local Affairs grant, is building fiber to carrier neutral locations, and they'll access fiber that's been installed along the I-70 corridor. Then typically what counties and local governments can do once the middle mile infrastructure is in place is many municipalities and communities will help facilitate broadband infrastructure deployment by either building it themselves, and many communities throughout Colorado are doing that. Some examples are Longmont and Loveland and Fort Collins, Estes Park. They all are building fiber to every home and business within their community and offering gigabit type services to their constituents. Other municipalities are building perhaps a fiber ring through their community that's connecting their key facilities and their stakeholders and schools, libraries, government facilities, and then they can use this fiber as potential leverage or capacity for service providers to lease to expand to homes and businesses. And what I think that Garfield County will be doing as our next step after the middle mile infrastructure is in place is we will be reaching out to service providers to establish public-private partnerships. And government entities can help facilitate lowering the cost of broadband deployment. They can do that through policies, through providing access to their facilities, access to carrier neutral locations, robust access to middle mile infrastructure, and they can enter into partnerships to go after grant funding or to help share in the costs and the risks of deploying broadband infrastructure to some of these rural communities. And so that I see as the next step after the middle mile infrastructure is in place and the carrier neutral locations are established. You're back, Brandy.
I know, thank you. Thank you for stepping in. Obviously, internet is still a challenge in my area because I live in rural Colorado still, so I appreciate that. So yeah, I'll keep moving along. These are really great examples of how collaborations work really well. And, you know, working for the state of Colorado, you know, I think the best collaborations are also at the state, when the state, counties, and towns can work together, because we can leverage each other's assets in a way that, you know, you just can't do on your own. So, so I appreciate the good examples. So my next question is for Diane. What are some of the barriers that you see in the successful expansion of broadband in rural areas? And what are some of the potential solutions to resolve to resolve the deployment of broadband? I know you have good experience across the state, but just want to hear from you on what you see are some of the challenges in your work.
I always say that if it were easy, it would have already been done, right? And so it is not easy to build out broadband infrastructure in rural areas of the country, especially rural Colorado. And some of the challenges really are ranging from, you know, low population density and low number of households per mile. And what we're talking about, just to give everyone an idea of why is this challenging, what are we trying to do here? We're building fiber optic cable all the way to every house and to every business. Wireless technology has certainly improved, but it's really a stopgap or a Band-Aid, if you will, approach, a short-term approach to improving broadband infrastructure. All of the grant programs that are in response to the pandemic are really targeting fiber-rich infrastructure. And so we're talking about building fiber to every home and to business. And so building fiber to locations that are rural and have low population density, low households per mile, that drives up the capital cost of deploying fiber. But also these, you know, areas are geographically dispersed. So they're long stretches of distance to build fiber to these areas that are unserved. One of our biggest challenges in Colorado is that we are in the Rocky Mountains. So we have lots of rock and we have undulating terrain and we have trees. And so wireless technology is challenging with trees because you need line of sight, and undulating terrain also is a challenge with wireless technology. It's an even bigger challenge with fiber optic deployment, and what we're seeing, many communities on the western part of the United States, they're looking at, because of fire and fire mitigation, they're looking at burying their utilities rather than deploying them along power lines or existing pole infrastructure. And so all of those things drive up the cost of building fiber. And this, fortunately, is a problem that can be solved with money. And, you know, we hate those challenges that we can't solve with money because they're even more difficult. But this one is something that can be solved with throwing some grant dollars and subsidy at it. So with additional funding and grant programs, partnerships between governments and the private sector, we can pool our resources to build fiber infrastructure to these rural communities. And we see that happening now.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, so there definitely are barriers, and I know all of us kind of have experienced some of those examples. And I want to just put the question out to my colleagues, the other colleagues on the call. What are some of the barriers that you've seen either in Garfield County or at the town of Silt that you've experienced with, you know, your broadband initiatives?
Kevin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, if I could. Thank you, Derek. We have some really rural neighborhoods outside of our 6 municipalities in Garfield County. And as Diane described, they're geographically remote, but there are also a lot of geological barriers. And our first effort out of the box was to focus on a wireless system to get out to those more rural locations that didn't have any internet service at all, because our municipalities all had some level of service. And we had a design to build a wireless system that included mountaintop towers and repeaters and wireless equipment. And it was just not feasible. It wasn't feasible from a financial perspective, primarily due to the low density and the low take rates. And it wasn't feasible from a technology standpoint because of the line of sight limitations drove the cost up so high. And it just wasn't feasible. We pivoted to this middle mile network system for that reason, that we could really strengthen the infrastructure side of broadband in our communities along I-70, so that private providers can come in and enjoy the discount of not having to build that infrastructure. And we're hoping that that does include private providers maybe taking on some of that wireless connectivity to those more rural locations. It's just really difficult to get out to some of those rural locations, and those people want and deserve broadband access just like everybody else.
Right, for sure. Yeah, what about the town of Silt? What are some of the barriers? Because I know every community is slightly different, and depending on where you are in rural Colorado, you know, those barriers could look very different based on, you know, what the dynamics are in your community. So what do you think, Derek?
I think one of the primary constraints we have is resources, and whether that's money, whether that's subject matter experts, whether that's aligning public and private incentives so that they're convergent. I think those are all things that are affecting the town of Silt. I would add that I think a lot of the residents in my town don't know what they don't know, not to oversimplify it, but when you start talking with them about municipal broadband and public-private partnerships, I think it all gets a bit hazy, and they sort of revert back to the default, which is, hey, I use ISPX and I can use my phone, I can use my television, I can use the internet. Nothing is broken, therefore there's nothing to fix. So I think we need to shift the language that we're using when we're having these engagements within our own communities, and I'm speaking for myself, of course, to really help with the understanding, to drive that understanding, because that's what's going to promote change. Does that make sense? It
does. And you know, language in the broadband space has always been, in my opinion, kind of a barrier. Like, what is it we're talking about, and people's expectations around it? Because in different communities, it's like, hey, I can use my phone, that's internet, you know? And so, you know, I've often been asked, well, what is broadband, you know? And defining it in such a way that, you know, people in your community, whatever their level of sophistication is around the subject, that everybody can understand what it is. And, you know, it's high-speed internet. It's not doing homework from your phone, right? And then the other thing too is, you know I've experienced this in smaller communities, is exactly to your point, where I have just enough internet to do my one thing, but you know, it doesn't really correspond to the rest of the community very well, like especially when you're looking at, you know, community will or political desire to dip into the broadband space, right? And so I totally hear you on that. And then just the provider mix as well. Like, you know I've been in communities where there's one incumbent, and that's just good enough for, you know, a really small minority of the community, but the majority just isn't getting the services that they need. And, you know, I know from the state's perspective, when we talk about barriers, we have some barriers at the state of Colorado. And a lot of those are, it's perception, but it's also educating stakeholders as well, just like, you have to do in Garfield County, Region 10, the town of Silt. And, we've done we're working on a lot of outreach right now to build awareness around the issue. I think the pandemic really helped with that. I think before the pandemic, the political will to deal with broadband really just, it wasn't at the level that it is now. And, I think getting over that partisan, we don't want to do this. We don't have a role to play as government. I think if anything, we do have a role to play as government in the state of Colorado, like Kevin said earlier, working with CDOT, working with DOLA, working with our agencies to remove those barriers. I know for us, we have some legislative items that we're working on within CDOT, and to help expand access of rights of way, make it less expensive, remove the barriers of entry. And usually that boils down to resources. So whereas the state really didn't have much money at all to expand broadband, we're definitely in a really, really historic moment where we actually can do some really great things and expand broadband out to the unserved or underserved. So we're looking at that too from a statewide perspective. What are the barriers? How do we do this in a way that makes sense for Colorado? Because every state's different too. And so we acknowledge that. The other thing that I think is very important too from a state perspective, when you talk about barriers, and this is an approach that we're taking, is, the Western states, we have this, we're pretty proud of our local control, local control perspective, it's not a one size fits all. So one of the things as the state that we're doing, and we're being very careful in our approach, because we want to be inclusive of everybody's needs, recognizing that they're different, is letting the communities tell us how to solve their broadband problems, instead of us coming in and saying, hey, this is what you're going to do, Garfield County or Silt or Parachute or any of the other towns in the Western Slope. So, the state can get out of my goal is for the state to get out of the way. And so I'm looking at all of those tools to help assist, our folks in the field to deploy broadband and get the money spent the way it should get spent. So we do have some of those barriers as well.
And just to add to what you were saying, Brandy, there's two things that I'm doing within my own community. Number one, and it goes back to the answer I gave to your first question, I try to be use case specific. When people ask me, what's the benefit of municipal broadband? Why are we doing this? We can talk about emergency services. We can talk about economic development, and I can talk about those specific use cases. I feel like that brings things into focus. To your point, to let the locals determine the outcome, it gives them the context. And then the other thing I say, which is more a platitude than a specific scientific thing, is we need to stop accepting and reducing ourselves to the lowest common denominator. We need to raise it. That's what this is doing fundamentally.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to future proofing. And, and I've heard in the field, because we've done a lot of outreach, like I said earlier, where I've heard people say that you don't need 100 symmetrical, like that's just too much. You would never use that in Garfield County, like you just don't have enough. And I'm just using Garfield County as an example, especially when people are making the case for not serving. And it usually is, rural Colorado, there's just not enough people, there's not enough devices, there's not enough technology, you'll never use it. But, we said some of those same things, 10 years ago, and technology moves at the speed of light, and we're here. I mean, even 5 years ago, it's just, so I agree. I think, when we're looking at our strategy for the state, we want to fund the latest and greatest and the best technology we can, so that, because we only get one shot at this. And we want to make sure that, we're thinking 20 years out, because that's where we are. And matter of fact, we're probably not even 20 years out. We're probably another decade out of needing more capacity and more bandwidth. So there's no harm in shooting for the stars, especially, and getting and connecting the underserved and the unserved in our communities.
And 100 is a minimum, right? If you've got 4 people in a household, each of whom has 2 or 3 devices, you're talking 12, 15 devices. That's before you add any Internet of Things type equipment. Cars are getting connected, our refrigerators and stoves are getting connected. All of those devices today, tomorrow, next week, next year, they are all going to have a prerequisite of connectivity. These things are going to pick up speed fast, and the requirements are going to go up very quickly. If we don't build for it now, we're going to suffer for decades, and it's going to cost us more money to do it then.
Right.
Kind of weigh in on what is happening at a national level. So in response to the pandemic, there's over $400 billion that has been set aside for broadband infrastructure. And so this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to impact many, many generations to come. And Brandy has the distinct privilege of administering and working with the grant funding that will be provided to the state. So what communities are doing across the country is they're, number one, refreshing their plans, refreshing their broadband roadmaps, or creating a roadmap that provides shovel-ready projects that are either middle mile projects or last mile projects, last mile building fiber to the home and to businesses. And this funding is going to be available. Some of it has been introduced now. There are grant programs that are available to fund middle mile infrastructure and last mile infrastructure. And these programs will be available within the next 2 years to allocate funding. And so we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to really get it right. And I often say that the challenge that we're meeting today is improving broadband infrastructure, and we absolutely need to do that. We need to look at increasing the capacity to all of our homes and businesses within the county and throughout the country. And we're solving broadband. In 5 years from now, we're going to be solving other things like public safety and climate notifications and smart driving cars and self-driving trucks. That's the technology that's coming. And so I advocate often for my clients, the local municipalities and counties, to retain ownership of some of this infrastructure, especially as they're perhaps negotiating with the private sector to build out, that the public sector should make sure to also retain some ownership of that fiber to support other applications that the communities may rely on in the near future. So I just want to stress that, yes, there are definitely challenges, there are barriers. It's really challenging in Colorado, especially and in rural areas of the state. But now is an opportunity for us to solve the problem, because there's a lot of funding that's available at both the federal and state level for broadband infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into what the overarching strategies are for the state, and because we're ultimately the facilitators of the resources, which is it's not a new thing, but it's what the way it's been laid out at the federal level. It's really giving states and local governments and our partners an opportunity to work together versus just giving grant money out to one ISP or two or three ISPs to do it. So from a state perspective, it all starts with vision and strategy. And Kevin was so gracious to share Garfield County's, strategy and talk quite a bit about it while we were meeting about this topic. And, the state, we are embarking on a statewide strategic plan for broadband and digital government services. So we want to do those two things hand in hand, because we want to increase our capacity, but we want to make, at the same time, we want to make it easier for communities and our residents to, use state services. And at the core of all that, as you guys know, is broadband. And so we wanted to tie those two things together because we think it's really important. But, our statewide vision is to focus on the unserved and the underserved, recognizing there are pockets, what I call as the urban fringe of, where you're in the urban area, you just don't have good internet like you would have out in rural Colorado. So we're assessing and looking at all of those underserved locations and allocating funds in those areas to help build capacity and spur those partnerships, public-private partnerships, there's some communities that go out and they do, they'll stand up a local public utility, broadband utility. But for the most part, what we're hearing from our community partners is that they want a public-private partnership. And we think that works very, very well. And so if that's what, a community wants to do, the state is 100% behind you as long as people are connected. And so, we have a variety of policy tools. Like I said, I think, at a local level, you look at your did once policies, you look at your right-of-way policies. How do we make it easier? What does our permitting look like for partnerships? So just like you do that, like at the town of Silt and Garfield County, the state is actually starting to do that as well. And so, earlier this year, Governor Polis passed an executive order, really giving the directive to the agencies for interagency collaboration, working on legislation that cleans up our right-of-way policies, making it cheaper and quicker for ISPs to leverage right-of-way. Thumbs up. Because it's been a barrier. I mean, when you talk about it, and it's not because people are, intentionally saying no. As people in government, we defer to the laws. And, I always say, well, we make the laws, we can change the laws. So that's been my attitude at the CBO. And it's gone over pretty well. So we have a pretty good, robust legislative policy ideas for the next cycle, the legislative cycle for 2023. So we're looking at, looking at easements. How do we leverage? How do we make getting easements for broadband easier? Obviously, we have one policy where we have a local government ban on providing service. And so, it's not as strict as maybe some other states, but it requires communities to go to the vote of the people for something that, we've already kind of determined as a utility. And so we want to remove those barriers to grant flexibility for local governments and community anchors to deploy broadband. And so we're looking at all of that. And then here comes the funding, right? We have the Capital Projects Fund, which is a treasury, money given to the state through the Treasury Department, which is about $162 million for middle mile that connects to last mile, because we don't want to build dark fiber like we did back in the days of the 2008, ARA funds, where some of that money did go to just dark fiber and it was never leveraged the way it probably should have been. So we're working on that. That is a totally community-driven process right now, where we're asking our communities to submit, their proposals for how they want to implement broadband, leveraging that funding pool. So, hopefully we'll get some really good data. We've had tons of interest by communities and partnerships. So, we'll get those dollars out to folks in need. I love that funding pool because as a community, you get to define areas of critical need, which, some of our other federal programs are a little bit more defined, but it's a real opportunity to say, hey, we know our community the best, and this is where those funds go. And the state has an obligation to make sure that we get those dollars to the communities. And then we have the digital equity side of things. So, it's not enough just to have broadband, but you have to know how to access it. You could have 100 symmetrical outside your front yard, but if you don't know how to access it in a way that means anything to you in your daily life, then it's an investment that, it wasn't leveraged properly. So we see, there's the broadband infrastructure piece, but what's also really critical is helping, the individuals that don't necessarily know how to access it so that we're not leaving people behind. And so, BEAD, I know some of you might have heard, well, I know everybody on the call knows about BEAD, but it's the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Fund. So the state will receive possibly up to $700 million in broadband money for BEAD to address, affordability, access. And so digital equity, I mean, those are what those funds will be used for. So the funding buckets really complement each other, and they really bring the broadband cycle to its full circle. And then, like I said, we have digital equity, and we're still, the state really did a great job last year by allocating $35 million, or actually $75 million of their ARPA funds to broadband, recognizing that it was very, very important. So a lot of money went to the Southern Ute and Ute Mountain tribes. So because they have really, really serious connectivity issues in the southwest corner of the state. So we were able to allocate funds there, and we continue to do our grant programs to allocate funds to ISPs to serve underserved areas. So it really incentivizes those investments that typically wouldn't occur without a subsidy. But, all of this takes interagency coordination. And so, I know sometimes in government, you can, go, you can call the government and do the phone tree until you get an answer, and it's 2 days later. So I'm trying to the state of Colorado is really trying to work together to make sure that we provide that service to our communities as well, making sure that we're coordinated and that everybody's singing from the same page. So, but yeah, it's great. Does anybody else have any other perspectives they want to offer?
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
I think speaking as a representative of the town of Silt, part of that public-private partnership for me, I've broken it down to what I call the 3 Ps. So for any vendor to potentially do the last mile, it's going to require they meet the 3 Ps criteria. Number 1 is performance, and Diane referred to that earlier. 1 gigabit symmetrical, which is up and down. Number 2 is price. It needs to be price competitive with the larger ISPs. It can't be gouging. And the third one, and I'm only bringing it up because it hasn't been brought up yet, is privacy. I think we're all well aware that privacy is recently becoming a very important factor in our lives, whether we want it to be or not. What folks may not know is that your internet service provider can and does sell your data. Wherever you go on the internet, they have access to all of that information, where you went, how long you spent there, what you did, and they sell it. Who do they sell it to? Whomever will pay them. So I think the third P in that triumvirate is got to be privacy. Whatever agency, whether it be public or private, takes on that last mile is going to have to guarantee in writing that our data will be sovereign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just one of many local approaches to solve your community broadband, issues, right? Again, very, very specific. And, and I love the 3 Ps, and they're all very, very relevant in this, in bridging the digital divide and making sure that it's fair, accessible, affordable, and that
You
people
can use it if you want. You don't have to credit me.
Oh, okay. Well, it's great. It's great.
Brandy, I have, this has been such an interesting conversation. It is a complex issue. What I would like as a layperson, not terribly informed of the technical aspects of how internet even works. And I imagine I'm like most people, where we just sort of take for granted that we plug things in and they turn on, except when they don't. And when they don't work as we hoped they would, or at the speed that we thought we were paying for, it's irksome, but we still don't know how to, most of us don't know how to fix those problems. I wonder, Brandy, if I could start with you, and I have several questions. Where is the oversight for this industry? Does that start at the federal level, state level? Is it how are we, where is the oversight for the industry in general?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I'll kind of speak for the state of Colorado. As part of our grant programs over the next 5 years, there is a heavy emphasis on compliance and monitoring. So basically what that means is, is if you receive a grant from the state ISP, and we do this right now in our broadband fund, we actually go out and inspect the project to make sure that what you committed to doing is actually happening in the environment. And that if you're committing to certain speeds, that those speeds they have to be accurate. You just have to do them. Like you can't leverage or use tax dollars and not report out on what the outcome was. And so the monitoring and compliance period for our broadband programs is 5 years after they're constructed. But for devices, if you're purchasing devices, for example, like in the digital equity program, you have to, the public. So for example, if the library purchases a bunch of laptops for community users to use, the library needs to make sure that those stay in the ownership of the library and are maintained properly forever. And so, that's kind of what we're looking at. From a federal level, it's a little bit tricky. The politics get a little murky at the federal level, but the federal level has recognized the importance of accountability in their grant programs, and the state is responsible working with communities and ISPs to make sure that that the projects are delivered in a way that that they made the original commitment to. So I've been telling communities that that's a really big piece of this.
Are there consumer protections for things that Derek brought up, like that 12% of milk? If I were to buy a gallon of milk and get it home and find out that there was only a fraction of that in the jug, I would probably go back to the store. Are there consumer protections for actual deliverables?
There are consumer protections. I was recently at an event with our AG, our Attorney General, Phil Weiser, and he did a really good job explaining this. There are, like, if you advertise that you're going to provide, for example, 120 up, and you don't receive 120 up, you can, as a consumer, report that to the state, and they'll investigate it. What I think happens a lot, and he would probably say the same thing, is that people don't do that. They just kind of live with it. And I'm probably guilty of that too, because I'll check my speed tests and I'm not getting what I'm paying for. But there are some consumer protections, and it's really what I understand is it's at each state level. So states have to pass policies if they want to be more restrictive than the federal government. But it is a consumer fraud issue, and you can report it that way if you feel like you're not receiving the services that you're paying for.
As a resident of Garfield County, I imagine your state switchboard just lit up with consumers in Garfield who want to file a complaint. I have other questions. Is there somebody that's doing this well? Switzerland, for example, has many of the rural, the distances between communities, the few number of houses in each community, the topography is similar. Weather is an issue. Are there communities around the world with similar features to Colorado that have figured this out? Is there a silver bullet and they were just able to fund it, and we just haven't aspired to raise enough funds for that solution, whether it's satellites or, I mean, you talked about fiber. Who's done this well, I guess I should say?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah,
Brandy.
you can weigh in. I was listening to a podcast, and there's different countries that are doing, but I'll let Diane speak to this because she does more work in this space.
So way back in early 2000s, I was the chairman of the board for what was then the Fiber to the Home Council for the US, and it's now the Fiber Broadband Association. And so we would track the progress that the US was doing as it compared to other countries. And one of the challenges of the United States is that it's just such a broad territory. It's such a vast geographic area. So it was kind of an apples to oranges comparison, but many other countries were ahead of us because they had a national broadband plan and strategy, and they invested early on in fiber to the premise infrastructure. And so many other countries were well ahead of the United States. But to answer your question here locally, I think that there have been hundreds of examples of communities that have invested in infrastructure. And we were kind of talking about oversight and who controls this, and broadband is unregulated. When the local government gets involved in broadband, they have more control. And when I consult with communities on public-private partnerships, there's kind of three stools or three areas of tension in a public-private partnership. And that is, one is control. So control really comes down to, is the local municipality or local government putting in funding, and do they have a say in how broadband services are rolled out? The other leg, if you will, is risk and sharing in the risk. A lot of times risk, especially in rural areas, it's very capital intensive to build fiber. And so the biggest risk is debt and debt coverage. So if a local government can put in some funding or can facilitate funding, that often reduces the risk for the service providers to invest. And then that third leg, if you will, in a the tension, control, risk, and reward. Reward is things like what Derek is talking about. Because broadband is an unregulated service, you don't have a lot to say unless you have some control or a vested interest in the infrastructure. So the reward part is things like ubiquitous coverage, building out to those areas that are really difficult to reach, pricing that Derek talked about. Privacy, I think, is controlled at the FCC level. I'm not really sure what we can do from a regulatory standpoint on privacy. That's those rules are dictated by the FCC. So has anybody got it right? Absolutely. There's been communities that are shining examples. The city of Longmont is a great example. They built out fiber to the premise into infrastructure. They offer gigabit services. They are a shining example, and they're touted across the country. Rio Blanco County also built out fiber infrastructure early on, and they just tremendously changed the dynamic. The economic development initiatives were all dependent upon better broadband infrastructure. And then there's numerous examples throughout the state that we really are a leader in the US. I think because early on we were limited in local government's participation through Senate Bill 152, and we could opt out of that law as a local community, that really spurred a grassroots effort in improving broadband services in our communities. And that really facilitated the state of Colorado to be a leader in deploying broadband infrastructure at the municipal and county level throughout our state. So to answer your question, Evan, I think that we're getting it right. And it's a process that takes a while to build out. This isn't something that happens overnight. These projects are sometimes multi-year projects to build out fiber within the community. But I think we're well on our way to getting it right. And many of the communities in the state have already done so.
It's clear that Garfield County has been proactive about reaching out to the state agencies that can help support bringing some of that infrastructure to our county and the region. It's a really nice segue. There's been a lot of conversation, especially in Garfield County and Western Garfield County along the I-70 corridor between Parachute and Newcastle for opportunities for economic development. Can any of you describe a little bit about what opportunities are there? What moment in time do we find ourselves in where there's a clear need and a potential opportunity to really either give somebody a leg up in an industry that is desperate for that last mile service? Or Kevin, go ahead.
Well, I think it's appropriate that you bring up the economic development side of this, because if we're successful in building a robust middle mile network, those partnerships, we're pretty confident are going to happen. We'll get last mile providers come in and help us provide more competition, and because we're connected to that broader regional network that has resiliency and redundancy, and that makes us more attractive to any type of industry that might rely on that, as Derek says, that utility of broadband service. So it helps us sell our communities that access is there, and it helps us attract small businesses that might work from home, that might not need a big office footprint or a big retail footprint, but can work on the internet. So we're excited about the potential to expand that possibility of economic development. And I remember 4 or 5 years ago when we started all this effort, that the Department of Local Affairs was selling their grant opportunities to these local communities like Garfield County, as that is probably the primary thing that you can do for economic development.
Well, I feel like we could probably continue this conversation for another hour. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Brandy, Derek, Kevin, Diane, I can't thank you enough. To our viewers, thank you for joining the Hearst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. This presentation was the 6th of 8 webinar events. broadcasting every 2 weeks from April through July. In 2 weeks from today, on Wednesday, July 6th, from 5 to 6 p.m. Mountain Time, tune in for our 7th event in the series, featuring a discussion on regional rural economic development. Thanks again to Velasco Language Services for your commitment to translating important information to our esteemed Spanish-speaking community throughout the region. Very special thanks to Alex Garcia, Bernal, and Garfield County Libraries for generously Zoom hosting this series, as well as co-sponsors Aspen Public Radio, the Silt branch of the Garfield County Libraries, and the Colorado River Valley Chamber of Commerce. To you, our participating viewers, you are of course always invited to check out upcoming events and ongoing projects of the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative at aspen2parachute.org. That's Aspen, the number 2, parachute.org. I'm Evan Zislis, Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to connecting with you at the same time in 2 weeks. Talk soon.